Welcome to a little bit of fun in the lab, networking with fish. We're going to be playing with AWS. We're going to be doing a part one, part two of this. Ultimately, at the end of part two, I'm going to be able to take my laptop and I'm going to be able to SSH into a brand new CSR and a brand new VPC that we're going to create together. First, quick props out to Dustin Schumann. Dustin Schumann is a dear friend and he is very much ahead of me on his cloud journey, but we've worked together for a lot over the years, and he's just a really good teaching style and understanding how I think and how I work. So he and I have got together a few times, and he has helped me, but then also allowed me to stumble, which has been great. So this is what I'm about to show you is possible because of all of that he has taught me. I want to go ahead and also pass that learning on. I will say that he and I built an environment together. I nuked it, and we're going to go ahead and build it from scratch. And I have learned a lot in the process. So what we're going to do first is we're going to go ahead and in part one, we're going to create a VPC up in AWS. Then we're going to create public and private subnets. We're going to create two subnets up there. One subnet, my intent will be to connect to the internet. The other subnet, my intent will be to connect to a local quote unquote LAN where I'm going to put a Linux box there. We're going to then create a CSR. We're going to attach the subnets to the CSR. We're going to connect into the CSR locally through AWS and enable SSH in the CSR. And then finally, we're going to actually SSH from ourselves to ourselves. But that way we actually also know from a troubleshooting perspective when we're attempting to SSH from the laptop in part two that it's not because the SSH is not set up properly. So we're going to go ahead and get everything done and going so that we can then move into part two. Again, really just following steps in part one. Part two, what we're going to end up doing is obviously we're going to have to SSH to a true public IP address. So we're going to add a true public IP address. AWS has it as an elastic IP, so we're going to create an elastic IP, and then we're going to attempt to associate the elastic IP to our subnet on the CSR, and we're going to get an error message, and then we're going to get another error message, and then a few other things aren't going to work. So in part two, there's going to be a bunch of troubleshooting. So we're going to go ahead and just kind of sort of separate part two, get through part one first, where there's really pretty much no troubleshooting. And then once we have all that set up and running, then go to part two. So what we're going to do first is we're going to create a VPC. So we're going to create a VPC and we're going to give it a name, and we're going to go ahead and give it a IP address space. We're going to give it the entire /16 block of 10.14.0.0. Now, for those of you who are familiar with IP addressing, that is actually what is known as a private IP address. It is not publicly routable out on the internet. It is part of the RFC 1918 address space. So that whole space is, and then we'll get to that as to like, well, then how do you get to it? We're going to create a VPC, and then we're going to create two subnets. I'm going to name one of the subnets public. And the reason why I'm going to be naming it public is because that's going to be the subnet and the interface that I'm going to associate with a real IP address and have out on the internet so I can SSH in. So from my naming convention, it is my public subnet, and the other one's my private one, my LAN, that I'll have a Linux box in the future. But just by naming it public doesn't mean it's public. It's still a private IP address space. It's just my intent and a name that I'm going to be giving it public. So we're going to create the public and the private subnets. Then we're going to create a CSR and attach the subnets. Then we're going to connect into the CSR locally through the AWS web browser via console. And then we're going to SSH, we're going to enable SSH in the CSR, and then we're going to SSH from myself to myself. Again, this is all step, so that I can tell you for sure that the SSH and everything is working properly when we then move to part two. So let's begin. So first we're supposed to go ahead and create a VPC. So let's go to AWS and create a VPC. So let's go to AWS, and I'm over here in the VPC. Now, I'm over here in AWS. There is this launch VPC wizard, just to let you know. And I'm like, well, I don't really know. Do I want this? Do I want, I was having a hard time figuring this out because when I looked, I was like, well, I want a public and a private subnet. But I was like, I don't know. I just really don't know. So I was like, forget it. Maybe I don't really understand the VPN wizard yet, but who cares, because I can do it the way I do know, which is I can just go ahead and create a VPC here. And by the way, I already have one VPC out there, but this is a VPC that I use. I'm doing a lot of stuff with right now. Now, if you're wondering why I chose 10.14/16, I do a lot of things that are configuring with intent. So I know that my existing environment is 172.31, which is also in the RFC 1918 address space. So when I create the other one, I don't even want to have it close to my other CIDR block of my other VPC. So we're going to go ahead and create a VPC, and we're going to call it AWS Ride Along. And the IPv4 CIDR block is manual, so we're going to go ahead and say, like we said before, we want 10.14.0.0/16. Now, my IPv6 friends are going to absolutely kill me because I'm not doing IPv6 here yet. The truth is, I'm trying to go ahead and step things through, and most of you know IPv4 better than you know IPv6, so I'm going to be doing one thing at a time because my intent here is to first get you to understand creating a VPC, creating the CSR, creating the subnets. So we'll do IPv6 later. So we're going to go ahead and create the VPC. And so there we go. Here's my VPC, AWS Ride Along. So if we go back to my VPCs, I now have Fishbowl VPC and I have AWS Ride Along. Fishbowl VPC is 172.31 and my Ride Along is 10.14.0.0. So what are we supposed to do next? Okay, we're supposed to create public and private subnets. So my public subnet is going to be 10.14.1. .0/24, and my private is going to be 10.14.14.0. So let's go ahead and go back over here. Makes this real simple. Right underneath your VPCs are subnets. So let's create subnets now. Here are my subnets from my my other VPC, which is Fishbowl VPC, and it says private and public. Again, those are just names, they're tags. So let's go ahead and create a subnet. So I want to associate this subnet with my AWS Ride Along VPC, which is in the 10.14 address space. So it's going to remind you here that basically these are your associated CIDR blocks. And so I'm going to go ahead and call this public. And so that I don't confuse it with the other one, I'm going to call it public Ride Along subnet. And availability zone, we're just going to go ahead and pick East. And this is what is going to be your block. Now it's going to actually 10.14.1.0. So it's going to go ahead and it's going to be like, well, do you want it /24? Do you want 32? It is going to go ahead and do this kind of stuff for you. I want 24. So the name is going to be this. It's going to be public Ride Along subnet. So we're going to create the subnet. And so now there's a filter right here, and there's this subnet, and here it is right here, and it's associated with my AWS Ride Along, and so it's 10.14.1.0. Now we're going to go ahead and create my private one. So again, AWS Ride Along, and we're going to have this be private AWS Ride Along subnet. And I don't even know if that's the right name that I had the other one called, but that's okay. Availability zone, we're going to go East, and the block is 10.14.14.0/24. So create the subnet. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go ahead and say we want to clear filters. And so these are all of our subnets. Okay, so private AWS Ride Along subnet. We're going to go ahead and change that and make it consistent with the other. It's real simple. Come over here to tags and then manage tags. And then we're just going to go ahead and take the AWS part out and save. So now we have my public Ride Along subnet, which is 10.14.1.0, and my private Ride Along subnet, which is 10.14.14.0. /24 on both of them. So what are we supposed to do next? We're supposed to create a CSR and then attach the subnets to the CSR. So the CSR is going to be an EC2. So let's go ahead and go over here to EC2. Now, what you'll notice is I actually have 2 EC2 instances associated with my Fishbowl VPC. I have a CSR and I have a Linux. I've currently stopped them because I'm not playing with them right now. So let's go ahead, and we're supposed to create a VPC. So I'm going to go ahead and say launch. I want a new instance, and I'm supposed to choose an Amazon machine image. So I want a CSR. So let's just go ahead and say yes. Now, I actually haven't gone into the community AMIs. And so, I don't know, it's just really silly. I've only done the AWS Marketplace ones, and I make this stupid assumption that I haven't verified at all, that, those are better. So here's the Cisco CSR, and it's a free trial, and it's this much money. It tells you all kinds of stuff about it. So we're going to go ahead and select this one. Now, I know that there's the T2 and then there's a T3. Admittedly, I know that when I created the T2 before, I couldn't console into it. And so didn't really understand this. So T2, yada, yada, yada. I'm not exactly sure why, didn't figure out why. I just saw that the CSR that I built before was the T3. So I went ahead and just did T3. So let's go ahead and configure instance. So no default subnet found. I don't care. Number of instances, 1. I only want 1 CSR. I'm not doing spot instances. I'm not doing that much of purchasing here. So the network, I want to go ahead and I want this to be in my AWS ride along. So this is the VPC that I want the CSR in. I want the CSR inside of AWS ride along, not my other one. So which subnet do I want here? I want the public subnet. Now my guess is with the wizard would have gone ahead and created all the interfaces that I need, as opposed to what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be going down to the bottom and adding another interface. So here's my public one, and I'm going to say auto assign a public IP address. Now it's not, so use subnet setting, disable, yada, yada, yada. I'm just going to go ahead and leave everything alone. But what I am going to do is I want to add another physical interface. The other physical interface is going to be my private. So up here, I have my public, and here I have my private. So we're going to go ahead and add storage. So I am attaching my public subnet that I created, 10.14.1.0/24, and my private subnet, 10.14.14.0/24, and I'm attaching those to 2 physical interfaces on my CSR instance. I'm going to go ahead and just keep this, add tags. We are going to go ahead and give it a name. Now, if you know, I'm going to do NA, just N, and it's going to go ahead and auto-complete what is a tag that is a key, that is a name that you want. So I'm going to go ahead and say CSR ride along, which, as you see, I've already given something a name before because I did this multiple times yesterday and screwed up a bunch. But hey, you learn that way. So we're going to go ahead and configure our session group. So think of this, our security group. So think of this as like an ACL. So I'm going to be having an automatic ACL security group of what's allowed. And it's by default, every instance I've created so far, by default, it is allowing SSH. Now you can just go ahead and kill that, and you can add other rules. It does give you this lovely warning here that says, you're going to have a rule that starts with, I don't care who it is. We recommend getting a little bit tighter on that. But for right now, we're just going to go ahead and allow anything that's SSH in, because I also know that I want to SSH later on. So improve your instance security. Your instance configuration is not eligible for free tier use, yada, yada, yada. I don't care. Launch. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and create a new key pair, and it's going to be CSR ride along. And I'm not going to be, it already exists. Ride along number 2. I messed up a lot yesterday, but learned so much. So launch instances. So we're going to go ahead and launch our CSR instance. Takes just a little bit. And then once it actually initializes and launches, we're going to return over to the view instances screen. And what we're going to see is it's pending. So it's going to go from pending, then it's going to initializing, and it's going to take just a little bit until this status check actually is up and running and nice and green. It'll be 2 for 2, yada, yada, yada. And then we're going to go ahead and move on. But it's creating it. So it's running and it's initializing. So before it was pending, the instant state now is it's running and it's initializing. It's doing its static checks. So we'll be right back. Okay, so now we're back and our CSR ride-along instance is status check. So we can come here, we can click it, and we can see down here the details of it. And we can also look at the security. So this is our security group that we just created that was associated with it. You know, the one that's allowing SSH in from any IP address. This is the inbound. This is the outbound. The networking. So the networking is, as you see, it's like, okay, not only did I attach the subnets, I assign them because of the way that I actually configured this. But anyway, so I assigned them. Now, I didn't statically go in there and say, I specifically want 10.14.14.73 as my LAN IP address on my private, nor did I say I want 10.14.1.85 as my public. I didn't do that. Now, so where did these IP addresses come from? Well, if I didn't do it and if it was assigned, obviously Amazon did it. Now the question becomes, are they also configured? Did Amazon actually go into my CSR and also configure those IP addresses? I mean, if I created lots of interfaces, would they have gone ahead and like configured all of them for me? Because this is the IP addresses that are there. And by the way, one more thing, again, while I called this subnet here 10.14.1, while I called that subnet, that /24 public, it is not a public IPv4 address. Want to go ahead and say that again and again and again. So what are we supposed to do next? So next, we're supposed to go ahead and we created our CSR and we attached our subnets. So we're supposed to connect into the CSR locally, look at the IP address, notice that one's missing and fix it. So, but let's go ahead and also fix this. So I have the question mark and the double question mark. So it looks like they did 85 and 73. Is that correct? So hold on one second. So now we have it fixed. We know what IP addresses we're going to go ahead and get onto us. So AWS said your public facing one is 10.14.1.85. Your private one is 10.14.14.73. But again, did they actually go into my CSR and configure those IP addresses? Let's go look. So we're going to connect into the CSR locally. We're going to look at the IP addresses. We're going to notice that one is missing. Spoiler alert, it's the private one. We're going to fix that, and we've also already updated the diagram. So let's go connect in. So if we have this highlighted, we can come up here and we can say connect. And our options are a number of different options. Now, if we do EC2 instance connect, just to let you know, see, the instance does not have a public IPv4 address. So, you know, before you can connect this way, you need a public IPv4 address. So we can't connect that way. And so we're going to go ahead and connect via the EC2 serial console. So let's go ahead and do a connect. And so here I am and I am in. So if I enable, I have no enable password. We're going to go ahead and do a host name, AWS. Supposed to do is do a show IP interface brief. Now the interesting thing is that the quote-unquote public facing one, the 10.14.1.85, got an IP address, but it's via DHCP. So what Amazon did was they no-shut, basically they came in, they no-shut that first IP address, so it's up, and they went ahead and enabled DHCP on there. Now if you look, so if we do interface gigabit 1, it's IP address DHCP, and it's also no shut. And if we look at gigabit 2, that does not have DHCP on it, and it's also shut down. So here's the question. If we do an IP DH address, DHCP, and we no shut it, right? The question then becomes, will it automatically get that other IP address? Is Amazon sitting there, and will it go ahead and also give a DHCP address to this as well? Let's find out. Oh, look, it did. So interface gigabit 2 was assigned address 10.14.14.73 via DHCP. So if we do and I've got the wrong name here. So let's just change that. Oh my gosh, I can't believe I did that. Host name AWS CSR. Alrighty then. Okay. So show IP interface brief. And so our gigabit 1 interface was no shut. It had DHCP on it, and it got the .85. Our second interface, so what I was told by someone was that the first interface that you put on will go ahead and get that. I guess it's also so you can go ahead and get into it. But the second one, that's kind of sort of was on me. So that's been my experience so far. But the only things that I've had two interfaces so far have been CSRs. So let's go ahead and go back over to here. So we connected into the CSR locally through the AWS console into it. And in the browser, we looked at the IP addresses. We noticed that one was missing. We fixed it and we updated it. So what we're supposed to do now is enable SSH in the CSR. So we're going to add a domain name. We're going to add a username and password, and we're going to do a crypto key generate. So let's go ahead and go back over into here. Password, and so now it is going to be crypto key generate RSA, and we'll go ahead and go 2048, and so exit right mem. And what we're supposed to do next is actually SSH from ourselves to ourselves. So I do know that we'll go ahead and do it to the public facing one, which is the 10.14.1.85. So we're going to go ahead and go back into here, and we're going to do an SSH. I will do a question mark for those of you who are not. So SSH, whoops the daisy, -L admin, and we're going to go to 10.14.1.85 and see Cisco 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now, how do we know that this worked, right? Well, first and foremost, I was at the enable prompt before, which is the reason why I made the enable prompt. I was at the enable prompt before, and also I got prompted for a password. And also, let's see if I can do a show TCP brief. So to show TCP brief, I am talking from myself to myself. So we are done, right? We are done. We created our VPC, we created the public and private subnets, we attached, we created a CSR, we attached, we went and did all this, and we SSH'd. So now we're done with part 1. We are ready to go ahead and get to part 2 and do it from a step-by-step procedure so that it makes sense to you. See you in part 2.